Copper is the bedrock of national economic and energy security. It's crucial for the future of data centers and artificial intelligence. It's the second most used commodity by weight in defense technologies. And it's hard to see a world where we'll be able to meet our future electrification goals without copper. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Brandon Craig, the president of BHP Americas. BHP is the biggest mining company in the world and also has the largest copper mine in the world. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Brandon, we talk so much now that copper is the new oil. Do you buy this?
Well, I think copper is essential in modern economies. So whether I would characterize it as oil, it probably serves a slightly different function. So copper ultimately carries electricity. It doesn't necessarily generate energy. But I don't think there's a modern economy in the world without copper. So in terms of it being essential to modern life, using that analogy, I would subscribe to that.
So we've talked about copper being used in a variety of technologies that are absolutely crucial to every part of our economy, right? Electrification with transmission infrastructure, EVs, defense, data centers. Is there one sector that you think is particularly important here that'll tip the balance for copper demand going forward?
Well, the interesting thing with copper demand is it's still fundamentally anchored in the more traditional sectors of the economy. So things like electric cabling, plumbing, piping, it goes into a lot of residential construction and similar. Electrical systems, transformers, that's still 90% of the demand for copper. But the other sectors, renewable energy, data centers, the copper demand that arises from that technology is rapidly accelerating. So although it doesn't dominate today, if you look forward into 2030, 2040, 2050, you can see that component of demand is definitely increasing. So on a like-for-like basis, you can see the intensity of use in modern economies for copper is starting to increase on the back of those new technologies.
Copper is very much a commodity of the past, present, but when you look at future demand, it's really growing. Earlier this year, copper was added back to the critical minerals list, which was a really big deal for a market signal. We talk a lot about supply chain crunches for copper. Is this hype? Is this reality? Can you tell us what we're looking at?
So I don't think it's hype. I think when you have a look at what global projections look like for copper, within BHP, we believe that there's going to be a need for about 35 million tons of copper by 2035. So the world is going to have to bring on stream an additional 10 million tons of production over that period. If you look forward all the way to 2050, we think there's going to be a 70% increase in demand. And then when you have a look at the rate of investment that's going into new copper mines, the rate of investment today is probably not high enough to actually meet that projection. And then when you couple on the back of that, most of the existing mines today, more than half of the mines are more than 20 years old. And what tends to happen is the copper grade that actually comes out of those mines starts to decline as well. So you put those two combinations together and you can see very clearly that the potential risk for a supply shortfall to materialize in the coming years is very, very real. And absent accelerated investment or policy reform to be able to support accelerated investment, it's a very real risk for the industry.
You mentioned declining ore grades, and this is a really big problem because we've stripped out a lot of our best copper in these aging mines. In your opinion, geology is not something we can fundamentally change, but how big of a threat is the geology itself?
Well, it's really interesting. So if you ask the question, is there enough copper in the world, in the ground? The answer is yes. I think the issue is that the rate at which the high quality deposits are being found is reducing. If you go back 10 or 20 years, it was quite frequent that we would find pretty large high quality ore bodies that were very investable and that we could bring to market. If you have a look at the rate at which those discoveries are taking place today, that's dropped off significantly. So the number of exploration successes we're finding in the industry for these higher quality deposits is going down. So that's really forcing the industry to have a look at lower grade options, together with new technology and ways of being able to process and manage those. The other challenge is if you look back over history, you'll find that most of the copper used to be found at or near the surface. But now you also see that copper is either going further up in altitude or deeper under the ground, which actually makes it a lot harder to discover, but it's also a lot more complex and time consuming to develop. So when you put all of that together, the copper exists, but the complexity is in how we solve those particular constraints.
So when it comes to addressing these challenges, right? I mean, BHP is the biggest mining company in the world, and we would have no copper security without a company like BHP, given their diverse portfolio of copper investments in new jurisdictions. We also see Resolution Copper here being really important, which BHP is at a very important hand in. How do companies like BHP work with policymakers to better ensure that we can have an adequate supply of copper for these really crucial and strategic industries?
I think the most important thing for us, we would describe it as policy certainty. So when we weighing up an investment, let's say hypothetically we want to build a new mine in Chile, we want to know that if we're going to invest $10 or $15 billion, that we're going to have policy certainty and regulatory stability over the duration of that investment to justify that investment taking place. Because the biggest risk we're exposed to as a mining company is you can't move the resources from their location. Once we invest for multiple decades. So the certainty we have on the policy position to be able to know that that investment is secure is probably the single most important thing we have to take into account.
So when we talk about, the long-term horizon, Resolution Copper is a really important project, and it's here at home. It's so crucial to American reindustrialization. It's so crucial to energy dominance because we know that we need to build a lot more energy supply, and that's both generation and transmission. What does Resolution Copper mean for the future of U.S. supply chain security?
Well, the first thing I'd say about Resolution is that it really is a truly world-class ore body. So in terms of the scale and quality of Resolution, it does actually stand apart in the world as one of the best undeveloped copper ore bodies known today. And it has the potential to supply up to a quarter of the US's copper needs based on current demand levels in the US. So from that perspective, if you take existing production in the US and you add to it the potential production that could come out of Resolution, it can actually have a very material impact on the US's ability to move in a direction that would make them a lot more independent in terms of supply chain security.
And especially at a time when there's not a lot of new copper projects coming online, and we're looking at a lot of very old deposits that we're mining right now. Now, I want to turn to, so you're the president of BHP Americas, which means you have some of the best copper jurisdictions that you're working in. We're talking about Argentina's and Chile's.
Yes.
And in the US right now, we're thinking a lot more about the Western Hemisphere, right? What role does the Western Hemisphere play in our long-term mineral security goals? Because we're acknowledging that mineral security is really energy and national and economic security. What does hemispheric alignment look like to you as BHP Americas?
I would define it as a huge opportunity. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can't really move the resources. The resources are where the resources are. But when you look at the Americas, the Andean belt that goes all the way from the north of Canada all the way down through to the south of Chile and even into Argentina, it's hugely prospective for copper. And it's not a surprise that when you look at the world today, about 40% of global production comes out of Chile, for example, which is a very highly prospective place for copper, and where we run our mines is BHP. We operate Escondida, which is the world's largest copper mine, and we have other interests in Argentina and Peru. So when you look at how much copper comes out of that region, you can extend that all the way through to the US. The US is also very prospective. It has a very strong geological endowment, and if you travel all the way through into British Columbia in the north, that geological endowment continues all the way into those jurisdictions as well. So there's a huge opportunity for a level of strategic partnerships or strategic cooperation between these countries to support each other in terms of a total supply chain ecosystem when it comes to copper. Because the combination of the geology, the development of that geology into mines, the locations of smelters, and then ultimately to end markets, there would definitely be an opportunity to connect up the entire region north to south in a way that would be highly advantageous to Western economies.
So building on that, one of the challenges that we know we have in the U.S. is not just mining copper, but how do we get that copper smelted both within the U.S. and in our allies? When you think about hemispheric alignment and partnerships, how do you see that playing out in the context of what we might call the mine to manufactured good? So not just mining, but that smelting and then ultimately manufacturing. What role does hemispheric cooperation play there?
Listen, I think that's an interesting question, and I think when you look at copper, you've got to think well beyond just smelting. So smelting is unique in terms of, you've got to think of smelting in terms of what is integrated versus what is custom. So when you have a look at sort of Western economies, I think you find the smelters that are economic are the ones where the smelter and the mine are integrated into a mining complex. We have a good case study of that inside our business in South Australia called Olympic Dam, where we have multiple mines that connect through to a smelter and refining complex that is currently very economic and performing very well. So there's definitely case studies in terms of how you can successfully integrate these facilities to produce quality copper products that you can then push through into further end-use manufacturing and similar. Where the industry has the most challenges in what we describe as custom smelting, where they're not attached to a mining body, but they literally buy and sell concentrates and process them into end products. And there's such a supply of those facilities that the economics of them are very challenged. But important, you can also produce copper through leaching technology, through pressure acid leach technology, and that allows you to take certain copper deposits almost directly through to finished products without smelting technology. So I think that combination of how you think of integrating supply chains together, plus the very thoughtful use of technology, and I think focusing on something that the US does particularly well, which is innovation, driving technology and innovation into the industry as well. That combination of things can really produce really beneficial outcomes for copper producers.
Brandon, I want to tease out something you just said a little bit, which was you talked about Olympic Dam. 2 days ago, the US and Australia signed what is really a landmark agreement that we've never seen between two major countries to strengthen minerals cooperation. One of the things I think the US, we're very good at innovation, but we have a lot to learn from Australia, a country that has it's 13% of Australia's GDP. There's a lot of technical know-how. There's a lot of expertise and history there we can learn from. Can you tell us a little bit about this Olympic Dam project and what's made it successful?
Well, Olympic Dam has a reasonably long history. It's a large underground mine that we've recently purchased some additional satellite mines that we've integrated into a smelting facility. The smelting facility is itself produces copper, gold, and uranium. So the ore body produces a complex set of minerals. So the processing technology you have to add on to Olympic Dam is definitely on the higher end of the technical complexity in terms of what it takes to refine those metals. So I think just going back to the genesis of your question, which is, does Australia have minerals technology in the country that can support, translating beyond base metals like copper into rare earths and others? The answer is clearly yes. Australia has a very strong mining pedigree. It's got very strong mining and mineral technology. And on the back of that, I think you can extend from that beyond copper into other minerals.
I think there's a lot that we can learn, and I'm personally very excited about this partnership. I mean, even thinking about things like how do we build our American workforce for meeting some of these future challenges? Resolution Copper is going to need people, and again, there's a lot to learn from that technical expertise. You know, I want to turn to another point you raised about some of this technology being economic. One of the questions we have is how do we make the midstream more economic? Do you think the economics, particularly of the midstream, work in the Western Hemisphere?
I think you'll need to depend. I mean, the midstream, there's a broad set of industries that make up the midstream of the copper industry, whether that's producing wire and so on. And there's very successful companies in the US that do produce wire very successfully, for example, wire, cable and similar products. So I think the combination of modern technology, automation, ongoing innovation can definitely support a manufacturing industry and a midstream industry here in the US. I think when you have a look at my view of what's made America such a great country over the years is their ability to innovate and deploy technology at scale and to be able to find ways to produce products in innovative new ways, and has led to the ongoing success of this country. So that thinking applied to the next generation of manufacturing and downstream production and copper is absolutely real in my view.
So when it comes to that innovation, can you tell us a little bit about recycling, substitutability? Is that going to play a role in meeting this future demand, which is quite significant?
So I think some elements of copper can be substituted. It's normally with aluminium, but copper has some very unique properties in relation to the ability to be ductile and flexible and to obviously be a very efficient conductor of heat and electricity. Because of that, it's still quite challenging to substitute out of a lot of products. And then what you tend to find is because it has a very long use, the rate at which it gets recycled in an economy is not very high. So when you project the potential recyclability of copper in the economy, it'll probably only get to levels of circa 20-25%. So you're not going to see this hugely dramatic recycling load fundamentally changing the demand picture, because once you put the copper in, it tends to stay in for an extended period.
And what do you think can enable or accelerate some of these efforts around innovation across the supply chain? I mean, I was just thinking about the US and Australia kind of framework agreement, and we do see recycling feature there. But what do you think the other enablers are for getting this innovation off the ground?
Well, we invest quite heavily in venture capital here in the US, which we think is very important, because we were having a conversation earlier about how the grade is dropping off. When the grade drops to a certain level, traditional technology is not going to be very effective. So moving into leaching types of technologies, or in the future pressure acid leach type of technologies, a lot higher recovery for the lower grade types of materials. So again, when you look at the US and you look at everything from the educational institutions, the research institutions, the ability to apply technology and innovation to the processing flow sheet of copper is a huge opportunity, and we invest substantial amounts in the US in venture capital to be able to do this type of primary work. And on the back of that, if we are able to then unlock technology that can be applied to future copper resources effectively, that could have the potential to have quite a transformative effect in terms of which resources become economic and how we can take them directly through to end-use products through new methods and new means.
And what does effective public-private cooperation look like to get that innovation going?
Well, I think the most important thing is, and again I mentioned this at the beginning, which is the policy certainty. When you look at large investments, particularly when you have to sink very high levels of capital into them, I think knowing that investment is secure, but also the speed with which you can move to bring that investment online is very important. So the policy certainty, the speed of being able to permit projects, those two things in concert can have a hugely beneficial impact in terms of capital attractiveness and the ability to do those investments in country in a way that's going to be economically attractive to companies like ourselves. Because if we know we can put money in, we can move fast, those investments are secure, that actually creates a very beneficial economic environment for us to invest.
So I'm going to ask you a question off the cuff here. What are 3 things that you're most optimistic about in terms of how we're going to meet that future demand?
Well, I think a lot of us are highly motivated to find copper. So there's substantial investment going into copper exploration. As BHP, we obviously have pretty substantial projects in our pipeline in terms of how we can bring a lot more copper to the market. So we have studies underway at Olympic Dam, which I was talking about earlier, where we're looking at how we could expand that facility. Escondida, which is the largest copper mine in the world. We currently have active studies in terms of how we can invest further into Escondida to be able to grow the volume that comes out of that complex. We have joint venture partnerships with companies in Canada, the Lundin Group, for developing what we think is a very attractive project in Argentina. And we have a couple of other smaller expansion options with joint venture interests and other things we have underway. And of course, we discussed earlier Resolution, which is the partnership we have with Rio Tinto. So you put all of that together, and from the BHP perspective, we definitely have a very attractive set of growth options. But it's also clear that the copper supply shortfall we see coming towards us is motivating a large number of companies. So BHP is not acting alone. I think there's a lot of our peers and competitors out there also very heavily focused on what they can do to expand their facilities, to bring online new facilities, so we can actually grow total copper production. And the level of investment going into technology and innovation is also quite significant. So again, if you track back over the last decade or two, the advances in leaching technology and other forms of recovering copper have improved quite materially. So you put all of that together, with the right focus, the right level of investment, the world can definitely produce the copper we're going to need. It's going to take about $250 billion of investment to get there. But that's not an impossible task by any means. And I think when you look at the mining industry or the global mining industry, that investment and also that focus is clearly there to solve that puzzle.
You talked a little bit about exploration, which I want to come back to. I remember somebody once told me exploration is the oxygen of the mining sector. If you don't explore, you won't find. If you don't find, we're not going to be producing anything.
Yes.
So you guys have made some pretty big investments in exploration. How do you feel in terms of the new innovations coming into the exploration space? Because it looks quite different now than it did 20 years ago.
It's really interesting. So when exploration is, the simplistic way to see it is people go out and drill into the ground to see what's there. But it's actually become quite a science, exploration. So there's a lot of technology that goes into finding deposits, everything from geophysical surveys all the way through to seismic work or geoseismic work you have to do. It produces huge amounts of data, and that data needs to be interpreted to ultimately find where the prospective ore bodies are. I think what we're seeing with technology now is we can go back over data that we've been collecting for decades now. And you can actually apply generative AI and other technology to interpret that information. So what would have taken us years and years and years of people applying themselves to trying to find where these ore bodies are, we can now apply technology to comb through that in sort of exponentially faster time that would have been the case historically. But it doesn't mean we have all the answers as an industry either. We still need to continue to develop better technology for finding ore bodies, because what used to be visible on the surface, you now have to find underground. And we can see it's getting deeper and deeper to be able to find the resources we need, particularly in copper. So if you go back 20 years, most of the copper was found at or near the surface. When you look at the larger discoveries today, they tend to be underground. and very deep, sort of 600 meters, 1,000 meters, resolution close to 2,000 meters. You need some pretty sophisticated technology to be able to find those. So the ongoing investment in that sector for how we do that is going to be a pretty important piece of the picture.
And for the exploration that we're doing today, you know, sometimes we get caught up in how long it takes to build a mine here in the US, but you have a much bigger picture than that with the Americas. For the mines that we're, you know, the places we're exploring today, when do you think we might see that copper?
Well, I think that's one of the industry's big issues. So if you look at the time from discovery to copper production output from a project, that can take up to 15 years, in some cases even longer. And the reason for that is how long it takes to characterize a resource, do the engineering, permit the project, and then ultimately bring it into production. So that value chain is quite long. So as an industry, I think we have to do a lot more work to try and speed up how we can compress the discovery to production timetable for what it takes to produce copper. And that's going to be really important. But that's a combination of discovery, the permitting landscape we have, the policy settings in countries. So if you go back to your discussions on how do we collaborate with government, it's about how we can compress some of those timetables. So that's once we discover things, we can actually move through all the various stages to bring that on a lot earlier.
So you almost beat me to my punch of my next question, which is what can policymakers do to think about how to meet, you know, supply tomorrow? We've been talking here in the US for years now about needing to get ready for the AI revolution and getting ready to build all of this energy transmission infrastructure.
Yeah.
But what should they be doing? Acknowledging that, you know, I think, again, I'm still excited about the US-Australia agreement. And a lot of it was, this is allies first now, right? Like we're working together. We see countries like Argentina being very important. What is one thing policymakers should be doing to meet the future need for copper?
So I've spoken at length about policy certainty. I won't cover that anymore. But the second key thing would be the speed with which we can permit projects. But that's a broad category. So permitting has got two components to it. The one component is meeting what is a significantly larger set of social and environmental responsibilities that go hand in hand with the project. Accelerating permitting does not mean stepping away from social performance or environmental performance. It's about getting the permitting process done in a more effective manner. So that's very important, because the faster we can get to that point, the more quickly we can invest and then produce the copper. The second is ensuring that we can find a mechanism to not over-process investment. So if you have a look at resolution, it's been in legal dispute for close on 13 years. So when we first started to get serious about developing that project with Rio, it's been challenged through various court processes for an extended period. Now, stakeholders to projects absolutely have the right to challenge these projects, but it's really, really important that we can move through some of the legal avenues more quickly as well if we're ultimately going to succeed to compress that time we were talking about, you know, development through to production.
So one of the things you mentioned here is the environmental social performance. And one of the things I love about BHP, you know, huge producer, great projects, but doesn't compromise on getting things right? Holding projects to a high standard. How have you continued to sustain that across jurisdictions that have varying standards?
Well, I think every country has its own history and its own rules that shape how it thinks about First Nations and Indigenous rights, for example. But I think what we have seen is that if you don't have your local community and your local stakeholders on your side, you don't have a business. So it's fundamentally important that you understand who the stakeholders are of a project, and you work in partnership with them to create mutually beneficial win-win outcomes for a project. And what we've seen is when you adopt that mindset and that philosophy of being very focused on who the stakeholders are, working very closely with them to create a mine that takes into account, or to create a project that takes into account the varying demands that people have, to try and find the best balance between social requirements, the economic benefits of the project, returns to shareholders, and so on. And when you think through that lens and that mindset, almost in a counterintuitive sense, you can move a lot faster through your permitting and your project, because if you get that piece right up front, there's less challenges, there's less disputation, there's less disruption, and in the end you can move forward in a sort of more beneficial way, faster to the end goal.
You know, earlier this year at PDAC, there was a debate on the main stage. Is the outlook better for gold or copper? The last few days, we can quite confidently say the outlook is probably better for copper, which has been like a really fascinating turn in the market. Do you see this run kind of continuing with copper?
I think I've learned a long time ago not to speculate on, on what's going to happen with things like gold. Like predicting price is not a smart thing to try and do. I think inside BHP we try and deeply understand the macroeconomic fundamentals playing out across a commodity, and that's why we tend to like commodities where we can see the projects, we can understand the supply, we can see what's coming on stream, where we understand the geology, and at the same time where we have some confidence in being able to predict the future demand. So commodities that you can actually understand the relationship between GDP, intensity of use, and ultimate demand, because then you can actually invest smartly in terms of what is the demand picture, what is the supply response, is there a place for the projects that we want to develop within that, and if we feel confident that there's a place for us to invest, then we can take good care of our shareholder money and investments.
I mean, really a company that's gotten market fundamentals right by just thinking very clearly about those drivers on a project level, but like you said, also a macro level. So I want to close with one last question. So we recently learned that the Statue of Liberty is made out of copper, which tells you how really deeply intertwined America is with the copper story. When we go beyond resolution, are you optimistic about the development of the U.S.'s copper sector?
I think the starting point should always be the geological endowment. And as I mentioned earlier, the copper belt in the Americas runs from Canada all the way through to the bottom of South America. And the US through Arizona and New Mexico is an intrinsic part of that. So the geological endowment of copper in the US is actually very strong. The issue is just it happens to be at a slightly lower grade to some of the other jurisdictions around the world. But with the right application of technology and the right policy and investment settings, that endowment can be turned into a very strong future industry. It's just about approaching it in the right way, and then that is a very realistic possibility.
I think it's really exciting. I mean, when you think about BHP's work here on the exploration, the investments in tech, every once in a while I run into a good company that BHP Ventures has invested into. So really taking that long-term game, but also obviously Resolution Copper, which we hope to see come online. I think it's such an exciting space, and I've been so, as this US-Australia agreement has been signed, how important Australian companies have been to developing America's mining sector.
Well, I think there's been an interchange in both directions. So it's quite fascinating when you look at the history of our company, the links back to this being a US company or US-owned resources back in the 70s and the 80s and so on is quite strong. So the history between the two countries is very closely connected, and there's been an exchange of technology from the US that supported the development of mining in Australia. Australia has continued to invest in mining now probably for a longer period of time in more recent decades. So some repatriation of technology back to the US would probably be good too. But the other thing that stands out for the US is it's still a center of innovation. So when you have a look at where we deploy venture capital, the large majority of it still goes into the US because it still has this innovation ecosystem that really rewards entrepreneurial behavior, innovation, and the deployment of technology. So even to this day, new technology, new discoveries, new ways of working and the new ways of processing minerals. A lot of that still comes out of the US today. So I certainly wouldn't underestimate the capability of what's right here.
I totally agree. I mean, I always say, I don't know if our comparative advantage is always mining, but innovation has always been our strong suit. I mean, our labs, our universities, our companies here have spearheaded some of the best innovation in how to use less material for more gains, right? And to do it cost effectively at a time when project economics have arguably never been more important.
I think for me, that's been, I would say, the defining character of the US economy is the ability to continue to innovate. I mean, you can go back to the theories of creative destruction, but in a way that's really real. You know, the US has reinvented how it does things decade upon decade upon decade, and that is what has led this country to ongoing productivity and improvement over the years. So, and that sort of force and culture is still very firmly in place in the US. So I think the opportunity here remains very strong. I think you've got all the ingredients in the country to continue to do fantastic things, and hopefully we can see that materializing.
Absolutely. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been a packed couple days for you here, but I can't think of anyone better to really talk about not only the macro trends in copper, but really how do we build a stronger Western Hemisphere aligned supply chain at a time when we need so much copper for these very strategic industries.
Thank you. Well, as BHP, we'll certainly be trying to play our part in that.
And a big part as the biggest mining company in the world and with the biggest copper projects as well. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure as we look at what a pivotal year this has been for minerals, for copper, for US, Australia. You know, the outlook is really exciting, and we're glad that you're with us for this journey. Thanks so much for joining us today.